We are here today with the editor-in-chief of Harbinger Asylum and the co-owner and founder of Transcendent Zero Press, Dustin D. Pickering. He is holding his first debut book, The Daunting Ephemeral. It's a full collection of poems, and after reading it, I have carefully selected the following questions. Number 1. Where on earth did you come up with the title?
Well, I was going to sleep one night and the words kind of floated through my mind, and several months later, and I assume this would be a great book title. Several months later, I was reading through John Keats's complete poetry, and basically I read that phrase in one of his poems, so I think it was probably a subconscious theft. It really comes down to sort of a short-lasted disappointment, which, in the context of the book, a short-lasted disappointment is just kind of generally life. Like you're always yearning for something greater, and that thing is not really, it's not really present. You never meet with it, whatever it is. So you kind of come in life expecting something, and you walk out without ever attaining it in a lot of ways. There's a lot of unfulfilled desire.
Brilliant. Did Keats or any of the other romantic poets, I guess, sort of leap into your soul and prompted you to write any of the following pieces in the Daunting Ephemeral?
Not really. I think it was more like generally rage, and there was a period when I wrote a lot of religious verse with religious themes. I read Coleridge, and I think that probably pushed a lot of that. I was reading Martin Luther at the time as well, as some of his various writings and exhortations and whatnot. And I actually quote Martin Luther in this book as talking about Jesus being a gift from God, and how we take that as the gift rather than looking upon him as something else, and that's the basis of Christianity. And I'm basically kind of talking about how God is, one of the things I was trying to hint at in that quote was that God has never actually walked the earth. And I really believe it. There's a lot in the Bible about God walking on the earth, and God's various attributes touching the earth and whatever. But it's really just a matter of allegory. God as a physical being has never been on this planet other than through experiencing through our eyes what is life.
Well put, well put. I noticed that, actually, before I segue into that, are there any dream state pieces, sort of along the lines of Coleridge's Kubla Khan?
I think a lot of my poetry expresses a sort of subconscious grappling with reality, and that's generally kind of what dreams like, going into the bordering and the surreal. I think the color green is a very surreal color because it puts you in a relaxed mode, and it's generally very reflective of nature, and kind of puts you in a very stable kind of, I guess it's the alpha waves, I believe, state of mind, and makes you kind of in a mode where you don't necessarily want conflict. You don't have a contentious attitude, and that's to me what the dream state is your mind loosening up and presenting to you various unfulfilled wishes and various unfulfilled parts of your life, that come together from so many days worth of time, and they pull together into these little dreams and a variety of symbols and images, which is a poetry is what that is. And so most of these, I think all these poems are pretty much dream derived, but poetry itself can be dream derived. But ultimately, I don't think any are necessarily from a dream directly.
I see. I noticed that you put that you split the book into segments, and I noticed that the Vanishing Point, which was, I believe, your second chapbook, is in there. What made you decide to split the book into segments?
Mostly because the first segment was going to be the entire book, and it was very short. It wasn't as much as I thought. I literally wrote about a good third of a notebook full of poetry during a month or two's period, and it was mostly the religious verse I aforementioned, and I didn't have enough material to fill a full book, so I decided I wanted my vanishing point in a full book, so I put it in there, and it's sort of along the same theological grounds. And then I started adding some newer stuff and stuff I had read to audiences and things, and not all of it's necessarily religious. Some of it's very political and socially motivated. But it was divided into the various segments because for the sake of the length of the book, and because I basically wanted to have it almost like, as you're reading it, there's a little bit of ease in reading. You're not just reading, a long collection of like 400 pages of poetry. You're reading bits and pieces of the person's mind as it develops, because the vanishing point came from like 2012 or 2000, like early 2013 or something. The recent stuff was more like late 2013, when at one point I was bordering on religious illumination and was writing a lot of weird, obscured kind of theological writings about God and faith and things like that.
Of course. Now, have you taken any of these poems to the stage at readings, and how was the reception?
I have taken many. When I was in Austin at the all-night open mic, I read for Fatima Hersey. I read a poem out of this book, and I gave her a copy of the book and signed it because I told her I had a crush on her for a little while, which I did, and I think there's still, it's generally kind of a admiration kind of crush. I think she's a pretty good-looking gal and a sweetheart, and a very good poet, and I like her very much. And so I read her a poem on the stage, and I gave it to her, and she said no one had ever done that before. She's like, this never happens. And I signed it and said, you're beautiful and sweet or whatever. Something of that nature. And I've read a lot too. Out of Bounds reading in November, I believe, 2 years ago. I read some of The Vanishing Point. The one that was the poem called Painted Like the Mona Lisa, which tends to be something that a lot of people have received very well, including yourself, Zach. Tattered like a flag over a used car lot. That line, it generally comes down to sort of how the values of America are kind of dying and kind of fading out, and there's no strength, there's no virtue left in this country, in its people. And I think that comes down to a lot of the pride is lost, our dreams are dying, our desire to free the world has kind of become very faded back in the background. That's why I say in the passion for justice and liberty has faded, because the U.S. military and our humanitarian efforts are still there, and our desire for peace and prosperity for the rest of the world is still there.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that we're just kind of moping, and in a sense we're unwilling we're a little bit less likely to want to act on these things, and in general people are becoming very passive and very isolated. And I think that's one of the beauties of the book is books develop active thought. They encourage active thought, and active thought and vigorous thought leads to knowledge itself makes you want to get out in the world and share it, and basically talk with people, put it into motion. I mean, that's what activism, political activism, is all about. Is they call it praxis, where you put actual political information, like protests and whatnot, or people who have informed themselves on political matters and want to protest and make things happen and shake the world up a little bit. That's what poetry is meant for, and it doesn't just come down to a quaking of political values. It comes down to shaking the spiritual world a little bit, kind of tossing things around and making people think and shaking them out of the self-sufficient smugness they are in is generally the human race can find itself in.
Wow, that's quite intense. Now, I've spoken to you about this before, and like me, you have an immense body of work. Um, what is your selection process like um, as far as making an actual book and putting it together?
That's a good question. I generally work with the most recent stuff I have because I think it's fresh and I have more faith in it. With this book, I actually, like I said, I had a whole collection of stuff on a theme and I wanted to make that the full book and it didn't fit, so I put other stuff in. Sometimes a lot of these poems are just poems I read at like Cappuccino Bono and at University of Houston Clear Lake before it closed out, and a lot of other. As far as the selection process, it's generally kind of an emotion thing. I generally just look at a poem, and if it feel like it says and it hits me powerfully, I consider it. If it just seems like rubbish or just cheap, wandering, emotions, like I just kind of like I might give it a second look later on. Sometimes I had a chapbook I was going to do called Coffee, and I had a whole notebook of poetry, and I must have read that notebook like 3 times to just be sure that what poems I picked were the ones I wanted in the book, and I would just put an X. Like if I liked the poem, I would put an X on the page or fold it down, and basically that was my way of marking the poem for consideration. And sometimes I narrowed it down and took the X off, or I might have added an X to another page. So it's a very long process, and it takes a lot of energy and dedication in general, to write. It's a very financially unprofitable business, but something about writing itself cultivates a sense of soul that most people don't have in the world as it is. And I quoted JFK on my Facebook recently about culture and the roots of culture being art, why the artist should be allowed to pursue their vision in society no matter what. Under no circumstances should they be stopped. And obviously there's ethically, I don't mean that in terms of like go out and kill and write about it or whatever. But there's a culture that we're trying to promote with our art. And my culture is one of compassion and sensitivity and an appeal to nature and beauty and understanding people as people in need, people who are. It's ultimately, honestly, my vision is very Christian. I've been inspired a lot by biblical texts like Ecclesiastes and a lot of the words of Solomon, who's one of my favorite wise men of the old. And a lot of Jesus' words, naturally, he's a very misunderstood man. People just cling to his personality and not his words, and that's what I want to try to awaken. With this book specifically, I'm trying to say, stop focusing on the personality and focus on the message, because the message is still there. The guy's body is gone. His being is his message, and we are the being of God. We are being itself, and a lot of what I say in this book requires you to kind of contemplate that what is being called God is simply not God.
Yeah, when I was reading it, I found that there was a multitude of interpretations as far as who is the actual deity, and is he or she or it actually present, and if so, where,
Yeah, that's generally a subjective thing. You can read into it throughout the whole book. In the Vanishing Point, I have an introduction where I talk about a female deity that is vanishing, literally is being put to a distance, and that's the feminine in general is passive, and I think of passive as growing away from also. And to me, that really just means that there's a sense of distance between the actual God and the real essence of being. And for me to say that, it takes a little bit of effort to and a little bit of guts to even say such a thing, because most people think of God as a direct presence, and I don't think of it as that. I think of it as something that once you hear the word of God, it's already been spoken years before. I guess this is the best way to put it. It's like everything that you're experiencing now has already happened, and we're just the ones just seeing it just now. It's kind of like the holographic universe thing. It's a very scientific notion that the past and the present and the future are all one flash and one illumination in the mind of a God. And when we experience it, we're just slow to experience it. Like a dream, do you ever think those characters in your dreams or have feelings or thoughts of their own? That's a weird question, but and it's taken for granted they're just images. But how do we know we're not just images? And
Right.
poetry itself is based on images, and it's life itself. So how do you know?
Yeah, humans may come and go, but words will live on. We're just physical beings. We're flesh vessels, if you will, and our soul is documented into that, into what you're holding.
I agree, and that's what I was getting at with Jesus and his message earlier. Is Jesus as a person is no longer with us. Jesus as a Messiah or a person who has experienced life in a certain way and had experienced a great death and had a revolutionary presence, is still with us in the form of his message and his teachings and the book that is written for him and a lot of other types of things. And strangely, I'm a humanist, but I think Christianity is the most existential and humanist religion that I could come up with. And I just really get, and a lot of Christians are antagonistic. They don't even understand their own religion, and I really would like if they could just open their minds and hearts a little bit and try to really understand the heart of the message is. And that's not just politics. There's not just a social message there. There's a message of awakening
And morality.
And it's a tendency to be in the political sphere to throw the words around like softballs and hit people in the head with them, and tell them, oh, you're wrong about this because Jesus said this in the book or whatever. Well, the heart of the message is the same.
Agreed.
However you put it is going to be one way or the other. And none of us are perfect beings. None of us are perfect role models. No matter who you look at, we're all worshiping some hero or another, and that hero is also full of faults and mistakes and errors. There is nothing there to make us feel. When we look at a person like Christ, we're seeing ourselves. In a sense, but we're seeing ourselves as the ideal. And a lot of the Christians I've talked to really, and my grandmother, for instance, before she passed, said she thought we were all growing into Christ. And I can see why they would feel that way, why a lot of Christians would feel that way. That really seems to be like the Blakean aspect of Christianity, like we're all growing into this idealized being. But the fact is, that's what we already are, because the past, present, and the future are all the same.
Exactly. We're not all insignificant specks. I think we're all... we are specks in a sense, but we're so much more than that. And when we pass, we'll become a conglomerate being, and I think eventually our quote-unquote lights will eventually find each other.
Right.
We're not.
That's why poetry is so full of light images. There's the word illuminations that like Rimbaud used. There's a lot of very light terms.
Even before him, religious poets, Dante, Milton, and even Blake himself, they kept mentioning different interpretations of the light. What is this light that everyone keeps speaking about?
D.A. Levi, the hippie poet of the 60s, and he spoke of the light being sort of like his presence and compassion. And he said in one of his poems, I bring this city the light, and here's how they treat me. And that tends to be sort of a thing that a lot of weird, outlandish individuals experience. and the artist tend to be that type. You get persecuted and bled to death in some form or another. That seems to be the heart itself. You know, if you think of like life itself as being a body, you know, then the artist is the heart of the body.
Yeah. Now see if you can interpret this. It was a Morrison poem. Thank you, O Lord, for the white, blind light. A city rises from the sea. I've had a splitting headache from which the future's made. What do you get from that?
And that's from the Lords and Other Creatures, isn't it? Yeah.
Lords and New Creatures, yeah.
Yeah, that's from Notes on Vision. That whole entire thing was extraordinarily existential. A lot of Sartre's ideas are presented in that book. He's a circle. He uses a lot of circle graphical kind of usage of, like, you know, theater and, you know, the way life itself is kind of like a form of theater. People going through motions, people as particles of perception that are brought together by the quote-unquote Lord, who are different people who he says, like I just said, they bleed, they get bled to death. We fear the lords who are secret among us, you know that, and you know those are the people that are really the ones entrusted, the shaman, the one entrusted with helping us see ourselves in new lights. So I kind of interpret that entire statement as meaning roughly all of that. When he says about the future and the city and all of this, it's like he's the very root of all of the images used. Like, I mean, the city, he talks about it being a circle, and how it's a psychic thing, you know, the circle and then the womb, and all these are symbolized as a circle. The Garden of Eden, a circle, everything is a circle, and we know that that's a very spiritual-esque thing, that the circle is the circle of life, and not just in the sense of, you know, chew, devour, but also in the sense of, you know, things, you know, move in a circle. You know, it's a motion thing, and it's a thing of balance. You know, a circle is one of the few balanced geographical shapes, and it also kind of, to me, symbolizes a sense of the balance coming from friction. You know, and the friction being like a wheel. The friction being from turning. You know, and the turning symbolizing continuous change in motion. So continuous change in motion. Basically resulting in a kind of perfecting of the circle, and that basically coming down to human nature working itself through and trying to understand itself, and we don't know the answer. You know, we don't know why we're here, who we are, any of that. We just do what we go through the motions, right? But one day we shall. You know, one day people will, and that's what I was referring to earlier about the Christ and the growing into Christ, and you know, because it's an ideal that that Christ the King had the answer, that he expressed the answer. We just don't understand it.
Indeed. Now, before we conclude, I would like you to read 3 poems from your book to give us a preview.
Okay, I will read "Painted Like the Mona Lisa," which I just turned to, and I just spoke of this poem.
Oh, it's one of my favorites.
Yeah, this is a great poem. Painted like the Mona Lisa. Why should my hand scour rough pages bent by jeweled hands to seek the creed of equality? The sons of agony would agree, to know is not enough protest. The world must shuffle off its paradoxes. Then we can talk freely of the human family. Should lovers be separate from each other's hands? The passion for justice and liberty has faded, tattered like an old flag over a used car lot. The television will say otherwise. It will induce a hypnosis that will strangle our sentiments until we are absolved of this ritual hatred. I forbid you to enter these dream gates. The counterpart of paradise is within you. I was under the impression you were painted like the Mona Lisa on forbidden scripts.
Very nice.
Yeah, that poem is very rooted in a lot of
I saw hints of Morrison in there.
yeah, it's the poem itself. There's a song by Bad Religion, and it's called Anesthesia, and Bad Religion's an atheist band. So when they say anesthesia, they're really talking about how religion is opposing a lot of cultural changes that are meant to alleviate human suffering, like anesthesia was. And he says anesthesia, I'm Mona Lisa. And that was the symbol. It's kind of a symbol of smug complacency to me. But it was, the face of a person under anesthesia. That was just my guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, but to me, that was kind of what I was trying to express in that poem, was how relaxed our wealth has made us in this country, how relaxed we are as people, and there's not enough discontent for action. And there's, the tensions between cultures and all. We tend, people in America, no matter what culture they come from, they tend to isolate. It's a sociological thing, like Chinatown and all this. And there's not, we don't want clashes, but we have plenty of room for all of us, But the point being that cultural changes a lot of times come from certain tensions. Cultural changes between classes, between races, between all these varying groups who are all competing for domination and control, or just simply to express their voice. And a lot of times I'm on the side of the disenfranchised and the poor and the people who are